Westminster Abbey holds more royal children than any palace ever did. Among its marble tombs lie the short-lived sons and daughters of Edward I of England, Longshanks, conqueror of Wales and builder of castles. He married twice, sired at least 16 children, and buried more than half of them, from infants who lived only days to princes whose descendants still wear coronets. Their stories map the human cost of medieval kingship. Some would link England to Flanders, Brabant, and Bar. One would inherit the throne and fall to rebellion, another would found the line of the Dukes of Norfolk, and one quiet nun would outlive them all. This is the complete story of Edward I's children. Their births, their lives, their deaths, and the long shadows they left on Europe. In an age when royal wombs were weapons of diplomacy and infant graves were commonplace, these are the lives that shaped a continent. Edward of England ruled for 35 years, from 72 to 1307. History remembers him as Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, the conqueror of Wales, the builder of Caernarfon and Conway. But behind the warrior king stood two queens whose primary duty was ensuring the survival of the Plantagenet dynasty. Eleanor of Castile became Edward's first wife in 1254, when both were teenagers bound by treaty rather than romance. Yet their marriage proved remarkably devoted. Eleanor accompanied Edward on crusade to the Holy Land, where their daughter Joan was born in the ancient city of Acre. She bore him child after child across 2 decades, following him from England to Gascony, from castle to campaign tent. When she died in 1290 at Harby in Nottinghamshire, Edward erected 12 stone crosses to mark her funeral procession back to Westminster, the Eleanor crosses that still stand today. 3 years later, at age 54, Edward married again. Margaret of France was barely 20, daughter of Philip III and half-sister to Philip IV. This marriage served pure politics, cementing peace between England and France after decades of war. Margaret proved a dutiful stepmother to Edward's surviving children and bore him 3 more before his death in 1307. In medieval England, every royal birth was a political event. Sons secured the succession and strengthened the realm. Daughters became living treaties, their marriages forging alliances with foreign powers. But behind this cold calculus lay a brutal truth. Infant mortality struck rich and poor alike. Even royal children, attended by the finest physicians and wet nurses, faced a perilous start to life. The statistics were stark. Of Edward's 16 known children, at least 8 died before reaching adulthood. Some lived mere days, others just a few years. Their tiny tombs in Westminster Abbey tell the same story repeated in every medieval household: hope followed by heartbreak, birth followed too often by burial. Yet those who survived would shape European history. Through Eleanor of Castile's children, English royal blood would flow to the Low Countries, to Bohemia, to Bar and Lorraine. Through Margaret of France's sons, new noble houses would rise. And through Edward's heir, the most turbulent reign in English medieval history would begin. This was the age of dynastic marriage, when princesses were bartered like precious commodities and princes learned statecraft in the cradle. Every child represented potential, a future alliance, a strengthened border, a continuation of royal blood. But potential meant nothing if the child failed to survive the dangerous passage from birth to maturity. Edward I understood this calculus better than most. He had witnessed the civil wars of his father's reign, when weak succession nearly tore England apart. He knew that a dynasty's strength lay not just in conquest and law, but in producing healthy heirs who could carry the crown forward. So when Eleanor of Castile proved fertile, bearing child after child across their long marriage, Edward had reason for both hope and anxiety. For every royal birth brought celebration followed by years of careful watching. Would this son reach the age of knighthood? Would this daughter survive to marry advantageously? The answers lay with providence, medieval medicine, and simple fortune. As we follow the lives of Edward's children, we trace not just individual stories, but the broader patterns of medieval kingship, the relentless pressure to produce heirs, the diplomatic value of dynastic marriage, and the ever-present shadow of early death. Some of these children would become footnotes, remembered only in abbey records. Others would become ancestors to future kings and queens. Their stories begin now, in chronological order, as we meet each child of Edward Longshanks. Edward and Eleanor's first child came into the world sometime between 1261 and 1263, though historians debate the exact year. Catherine lived perhaps a year, maybe less. Her brief existence represents the harsh reality of 13th century infant mortality. Even royal children faced overwhelming odds against survival. We know little of Catherine beyond her name and approximate dates. She was buried with the dignity befitting a king's daughter, though her tomb has long since vanished. Her death would have devastated the young couple, but they could not grieve long. The dynasty demanded more attempts, more hopes for a surviving heir. Catherine's line ended with her death. She left no mark on European politics, no descendants to carry her blood forward. Yet her brief life established a pattern that would repeat throughout Eleanor's childbearing years. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, hope, and too often, heartbreak. Eleanor's second daughter, Joan, arrived in 1265 amid the chaos of civil war. Simon de Montfort's rebellion had thrown England into turmoil, and Edward himself was briefly held captive by the rebel barons. In such circumstances, a royal birth should have brought joy and stability. Instead, Joan lived only a few months. Like her sister Catherine, she succumbed to one of the countless ailments that claimed medieval infants. Perhaps fever, perhaps simply the failure to thrive that modern medicine might prevent, but 13th century physicians could not. Joan was buried with royal honors, another small tomb in Westminster Abbey's growing collection of Plantagenet children. Her death left Eleanor still without a surviving child after 4 years of marriage, a situation that would have caused mounting anxiety for the royal couple and their advisors. The infant Joan's legacy exists only in the grief she caused and the determination she inspired. Edward and Eleanor would continue trying for children, driven by duty and hope in equal measure. At last, a son. John's birth in 1266 brought celebration throughout the realm. Here was the heir England needed, a prince who might grow to kingship and continue the Plantagenet line. For 5 years, John represented the future of the dynasty. The young prince was carefully guarded and educated. Royal physicians attended his every illness. Wet nurses were selected for their health and character. Tutors began preparing him for eventual rule, teaching the basics of reading, writing, and princely behavior appropriate to his tender years. But in 1271, death came for John as it had for his sisters. He was 5 years old enough to have shown personality, old enough for his parents to have formed deep attachments, old enough to make his loss devastating. The heir apparent was dead, leaving Edward once again without a male successor. John was buried in Westminster Abbey with full royal honors. His tomb bore inscriptions befitting a prince who had carried the hopes of a kingdom. Yet for all the ceremony, John's death represented failure. The failure of medieval medicine, the failure of careful planning, the failure of royal privilege to protect the most precious life in the realm. His line died with him. The crown would pass elsewhere to brothers yet unborn. 2 years after John's death, Eleanor bore another son. Henry arrived in 1268, once again raising hopes for the succession. This prince lived longer than his brother, 6 full years, long enough to begin serious education, long enough to show promise as a future king. Henry was named for his grandfather, Henry III, and carried the expectations that came with royal birth. He learned to ride, to read Latin, to understand the basics of governance that would one day be his responsibility. Court chroniclers noted his intelligence and bearing, traits that boded well for his eventual reign. But in 1274, Henry joined his siblings in Westminster Abbey's royal vault. He was 6 years old, another promising heir cut down before maturity. His death left Edward and Eleanor devastated and once again without a male heir. The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. Eleanor could conceive and bear healthy sons, but she could not keep them alive past early childhood. 2 potential kings lay buried, their promise unfulfilled, their dynasty's future uncertain. Henry's tomb stood beside his brother John's, twin monuments to royal grief and dynastic fragility. Like John, Henry left no descendants, no continuation of his line. The crown would pass to others whenever a son might survive long enough to inherit it. In 1269, Eleanor of Castile bore her first surviving child to reach adulthood. Eleanor of England, named for her mother, would live 29 years and become a crucial link between English and continental nobility. Young Eleanor's survival past infancy brought immense relief to her parents. Here, finally, was a child who thrived, who grew strong, who might fulfill the dynastic purposes for which royal children were born. Though she could not inherit the throne, she could cement alliances through marriage. In 1293, Eleanor married Henry III of Bar, a count whose territories lay in what is now eastern France. The marriage served Edward I's continental policies, strengthening English influence in regions bordering France and the Holy Roman Empire. Eleanor's dowry and political connections made her husband a valuable ally. Eleanor bore 2 children who carried English royal blood into new lines. Her son Edward became Count of Bar, while her daughter Joan married John de Warenne, 7th Earl of Surrey. Through Joan, Eleanor's bloodline entered one of England's most powerful noble families, eventually reaching the highest ranks of the English aristocracy. Eleanor died in 1298, still young but having fulfilled her dynastic purpose. Her line continued through both children. The Bar inheritance passed through Edward, while Joan's marriage linked the Warrenists to royal blood. Modern genealogists can trace Eleanor's descendants through multiple European noble families, making her one of Edward I's most genealogically successful children. Her tomb in Bar marked the resting place of an English princess who had successfully bridged 2 worlds, carrying Plantagenet blood to the continent while maintaining English political connections through her children's marriages. Historical records suggest Eleanor may have borne another child around 1271 or 1272, though details remain uncertain. This infant, if it existed, died very young, perhaps within days or weeks of birth. Such uncertainty reflects the incomplete nature of medieval record-keeping, especially for children who died in infancy. Royal chroniclers focused on surviving heirs and political events. Babies who died quickly might merit only brief mentions in administrative documents. If this child existed, it joins the tragic roll of Edward's children who never reached maturity. Another hope extinguished, another small tomb in Westminster Abbey, another reminder of medieval mortality's cruel indifference to royal status. The line, such as it was, ended immediately. No descendants, no political marriages, no continuation, just another brief life in an age when brief lives were commonplace. Eleanor's most famous surviving daughter was born in Acre during Edward's crusade to the Holy Land. Joan of Acre would live 35 years and become ancestress to some of England's most powerful noble families. Born in the shadow of the Holy Sepulchre, Joan's birth carried symbolic weight. Here was a crusader's daughter, born in the land where Christ had walked. Her early years were spent traveling between England and Gascony as her parents administered their vast territories. In 1290, Joan married Gilbert de Clare, 6th Earl of Gloucester, one of England's wealthiest and most powerful barons. The marriage strengthened Edward's control over Wales and brought the crown closer to the mighty Clare inheritance. Joan bore 4 children by Gilbert, including Gilbert de Clare, 7th Earl of Gloucester, who would die at Bannockburn. After Gilbert's death in 1295, Joan shocked the court by secretly marrying Ralph de Monthermer, a simple knight in her household. Edward I initially imprisoned Ralph for his presumption, but eventually accepted the marriage, even creating Ralph Earl of Gloucester in right of his wife. Joan's children by both marriages carried royal blood into multiple noble lines. Through her daughter, Margaret de Clare, Joan became ancestress to the powerful Despencer family. Through her son Gilbert de Clare, she connected to the Mortimers and eventually to the House of York. Her descendants by Ralph de Monthermer also achieved noble status. Joan died in 1307, the same year as her father. She was buried in the Clare family vault at Tewkesbury Abbey, her tomb reflecting her status as both royal daughter and great noble heiress. Her bloodline spread through English nobility like branches of a mighty tree, reaching the Despensers, the Mortimers, the Staffords, and eventually the royal house itself. Modern genealogists consider Joan of Acre one of the most important ancestral figures in English noble history. Nearly every major noble family of the later Middle Ages carried some portion of her blood. In 1273, Eleanor finally bore a son who survived infancy and showed every sign of growing to maturity. Alfonso, named for Eleanor's royal Castilian relatives, became Edward's beloved heir and the hope of the dynasty. Alfonso thrived where his brothers had failed. He survived the dangerous first years, learned to walk and talk, began his education in languages and statecraft. As Earl of Chester, he held one of England's premier titles and was groomed for eventual kingship with all the care medieval pedagogy could provide. The young prince showed intelligence and promise. Court records speak of his quick wit and noble bearing. His parents and tutors prepared him for a future that seemed assured. He would inherit the throne, marry advantageously, continue the Plantagenet line into another generation. But in 1284, at age 10, Alfonso died suddenly. Medieval medicine could offer no explanation beyond the familiar phrase, "by God's will." Perhaps fever, perhaps plague, perhaps simple bodily failure. The cause mattered less than the devastating result. Alfonso's death shattered Edward and Eleanor. Here was their most promising son, the heir who had survived past the dangerous early years, cut down just as his education was beginning to show results. His funeral at Westminster Abbey rivaled those of crowned kings. With Alfonso's death, his line ended. The crown would pass to his younger brother Edward. Born the same year Alfonso died. The irony was cruel. Just as one heir departed, another arrived, as if fate demanded the dynasty balance hope with grief in equal measure. Margaret of England would become Duchess of Brabant and live one of the longest lives of any of Edward's children. Born in 1275, she survived 58 years and played a crucial role in Low Countries politics. Margaret's survival to adulthood made her a valuable diplomatic asset. In 1290, she married Hussar John II of Brabant, a duke whose territories included much of modern Belgium and southern Netherlands. The marriage strengthened English wool trade routes and provided Edward with a continental ally against France. As Duchess of Brabant, Margaret governed one of Europe's wealthiest regions. The Low Countries' textile cities generated enormous profits from English wool, and Margaret's position helped secure English commercial interests while advancing Brabant's political goals. Margaret bore children who carried English royal blood into the heart of continental nobility. Her descendants would intermarry with the great houses of the Low Countries, spreading Plantagenet lineage through Flanders, Hainaut, and Holland. She died in 1333 or 1334, having outlived her father by more than 25 years. Her long life allowed her to see the troubled reign of her brother Edward II and the early years of her nephew Edward III. She was buried in Brussels with ducal honors, her tomb reflecting her status as both English princess and Brabant duchess. Margaret's bloodline continued through multiple children, connecting Edward I's legacy to the great noble houses of the Low Countries. Her descendants would rule duchies and counties for generations, making her one of Edward's most genealogically successful children. Berengaria lived only 2 years, another daughter claimed by the high infant mortality of the age. Born in 1276, she died in 1278, old enough to have been baptized and named, but too young to have made any mark on history. Her brief life followed the now familiar pattern of Edward's children: birth, hope, careful nursing, then sudden death, despite every effort to preserve her life. Royal physicians, wet nurses, and careful feeding could not protect Berengaria from whatever ailment claimed her. She was buried in Westminster Abbey with the honors due a king's daughter. Her small tomb joined those of her siblings in the royal vault, another monument to parental grief and dynastic uncertainty. Berengaria's line ended with her death. She left no descendants, no political marriages, no continuation of her bloodline. Her legacy exists only in the sorrow she caused and the historical record of her brief existence. Around 1278, Eleanor may have borne another child who died in infancy. Like the earlier unnamed infant, this child's existence remains uncertain, recorded only in fragmentary administrative documents. If this infant existed, its life measured in days or weeks rather than years. Such brief existences were common in an age when childbirth and early infancy carried enormous risks, even for the wealthy and well cared for. The uncertain record reflects medieval chroniclers' focus on children who survived long enough to matter politically. Infants who died quickly might merit only brief administrative notes, their names and exact dates lost to time. Whatever the truth, this possible child joins the roll of Edward's children who never reached maturity. Another brief life, another quick death, another reminder of the fragility that haunted even royal families. Mary of Woodstock chose a path unique among Edward's daughters. She became a Benedictine nun and lived 54 years in religious contemplation. Born in 1278 at Woodstock Palace, she would outlive all her siblings except her youngest half-brothers. Unlike her sisters, Mary never married or bore children. Instead, she entered Amesbury Priory in Wiltshire, a prestigious religious house favored by royal women. As a nun, Mary enjoyed considerable comfort and independence while dedicating her life to prayer and religious observance. Mary's decision to enter religious life may have been voluntary or arranged by her family. Royal daughters sometimes became nuns when political marriages proved unnecessary or impossible. In Mary's case, her sisters Eleanor, Joan, and Margaret had already fulfilled the dynasty's need for continental alliances. At Amesbury, Mary lived comfortably on revenues provided by her father and maintained by her royal relatives. She participated in the religious life of the community while enjoying privileges befitting her royal birth. Her position allowed her to correspond with family members and maintain awareness of political developments. Mary died in 1332, having witnessed the reigns of her father Edward I, her brother Edward II, and the early years of her nephew Edward III. She was buried at Amesbury with honors appropriate to both her royal birth and religious vocation. Mary's line ended with her vows of celibacy. She left no descendants, but her long life and religious dedication provided a different model of royal service, one focused on spiritual rather than political goals. Elizabeth was born at Rhuddlan Castle in Wales during Edward's conquest of that principality. She would live 34 years and become ancestress to some of England's most important noble families, including the future Henry V. Elizabeth's first marriage, arranged in childhood, was to John I of Holland. This union was designed to strengthen English alliances in the Low Countries and provide Edward with another continental supporter. However, John died in 1299 before the marriage could be consummated. In 1302, Elizabeth married Humphrey de Bohun, 4th Earl of Hereford, one of England's premier earls and a leader of the baronial opposition to her brother Edward II. This marriage brought Elizabeth into one of England's most powerful families and created complicated political dynamics during Edward II's troubled reign. Elizabeth bore 10 children by Humphrey de Bohun, creating an extensive network of descendants who would shape English history for generations. Her daughter Eleanor de Bohun married Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, while her daughter Mary de Bohun married Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry IV. Through Mary de Bohun, Elizabeth became ancestress to the Lancastrian kings. Her great-grandson, Henry V, would conquer France at Agincourt, while her descendants would fight in the Wars of the Roses and eventually unite the rival houses through Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth died in 1316, survived by most of her children and having established one of the most significant bloodlines in English history. She was buried in the Bohun family vault at Walden Abbey, her tomb reflecting her status as both royal daughter and great noble heiress. Her descendants spread through English nobility like tributaries of a great river, reaching the highest ranks of the aristocracy and eventually the throne itself. Modern genealogists consider Elizabeth of Rhuddlan one of the most important ancestral figures in English royal history. In 1284, Eleanor of Castile bore her final child and only surviving son. Edward of Caernarfon would inherit the throne as Edward II and live one of the most turbulent reigns in English history. Born at Caernarfon Castle during his father's Welsh campaigns, Edward was proclaimed Prince of Wales in 1301, the first English heir to bear that title. He survived where his brothers had perished, growing to maturity under his father's watchful eye. Edward II proved a problematic heir and a troubled king. His close relationships with male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, created political crises that weakened royal authority. His military failures in Scotland, including the devastating defeat at Bannockburn in 1314, further undermined his position. In 1308, Edward married Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV. The marriage produced 4 children, including the future Edward III, but Isabella eventually turned against her husband and joined the baronial opposition that deposed him in 1327. Edward II's reign ended in abdication and death, but his line continued through his son Edward III, who would become one of England's greatest warrior kings. Through Edward III, the Plantagenet dynasty continued for another century, eventually branching into the houses of Lancaster and York. Edward II died in 1327, probably murdered at Berkeley Castle. Despite his personal failures and political disasters, his bloodline proved the most significant of all Edward I's children. Every subsequent English monarch descends from Edward II through Edward III. His legacy remains complex: a failed king whose line produced great rulers, a weak father whose son conquered France, a deposed monarch whose descendants would rule England for centuries. Edward I's marriage to Margaret of France produced 3 children who survived to adulthood. Thomas of Brotherton, born in 1300, would become Earl of Norfolk and founder of a noble line that continues today. Born when Edward I was 61, Thomas grew up during the final years of his father's reign and the early troubles of his half-brother Edward II. As Earl of Norfolk, Thomas held one of England's premier titles and played important roles in the political crises that marked the early 14th century. Thomas served as a military commander in Scotland and France, proving more competent than his half-brother the king. During Edward II's deposition crisis, Thomas initially supported the king but eventually joined the baronial coalition that placed Edward III on the throne in 1327. Thomas married Alice Hales around 1320 and later Margaret, Duchess of Norfolk, in her own right. Through his marriages and his earldom, Thomas established the Brotherton line as one of England's most significant noble families. Thomas died in 1338, leaving children who carried his blood into the highest ranks of English nobility. His daughter Margaret became Duchess of Norfolk in her own right, while his son Edward inherited his father's earldom and military reputation. The Brotherton line continued through Thomas's descendants, eventually passing through marriage to the Mowbray family and later to the Howards. The current Duke of Norfolk descends from Thomas of Brotherton through this complex inheritance, making Thomas's bloodline one of the most enduring in English aristocracy. Thomas's tomb in Bury St. Edmund's Abbey marked the resting place of Edward I's most genealogically successful son after Edward II. His descendants would serve English monarchs for centuries, bearing some of the realm's highest titles and maintaining their royal connections through generations. Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, lived a shorter but equally dramatic life. Born in 1301, he served as both military commander and political figure during the reigns of Edward II and Edward III. Edmund proved himself an able soldier in the Scottish Wars and later in Gascony, where he served as Edward II's lieutenant. Unlike his brother Thomas, Edmund remained loyal to Edward II longer during the deposition crisis, but eventually joined the coalition that placed Edward III on the throne. In 1321, Edmund married Margaret Wake, a noble heiress whose inheritance strengthened his position among the English aristocracy. The marriage produced several children who would play significant roles in later 14th century politics. Edmund's loyalty to his royal relatives proved his downfall. In 1330, he was executed for allegedly plotting to restore the deposed Edward II, whom Edmund believed was still alive. His death represented one of the first political executions of Edward III's personal rule. Despite his tragic end, Edmund's bloodline proved remarkably significant. His daughter Joan of Kent married Edward the Black Prince, heir to Edward III, making her Princess of Wales and mother to the future Richard II. Through Joan of Kent, Edmund's blood entered the royal line directly. Richard II, though ultimately deposed and murdered, represented the continuation of Edmund's lineage at the highest level of English society. Edmund was buried initially at Winchester but later moved to Westminster Abbey. His tomb reflected both his royal birth and his tragic end. Honored as Edward I's son, but remembered as a political victim of 14th century court intrigue. His legacy lived on through his descendants, particularly through Joan of Kent's royal marriage. Modern genealogists trace numerous noble lines back to Edmund of Woodstock, making him another of Edward I's genealogically successful children. Margaret of France's only daughter, Eleanor, lived just 5 years. Born in 1306, she died in 1311, another victim of the high child mortality that claimed so many of Edward's children. Eleanor's brief life spanned the final year of Edward I's reign and the early troubles of Edward II's kingship. As Edward's youngest child, she might have served important diplomatic purposes through marriage, but death claimed her before such arrangements could be made. She was buried with the royal honors appropriate to her status as the king's daughter. Her small tomb joined those of her many siblings who had died in childhood, another monument to the fragility that haunted even the most privileged families. Eleanor's line ended with her death. She left no descendants, no political marriages, no continuation of her bloodline. Her legacy exists only in the grief she caused her parents and the historical record of her brief existence. With Eleanor's death, Margaret of France's childbearing ended. 3 children in 6 years, with only 2 surviving to adulthood, a better survival rate than Eleanor of Castile had achieved, but still marked by the losses that defined medieval parenthood. 3 lines persisted from Edward Longshanks' 16 children, and through them his blood flows through nearly every significant family in subsequent English history. The royal line continued through Edward II, despite his tragic reign. Edward III transformed the crown his father had nearly destroyed, conquering France and establishing England as Europe's premier military power. Through Edward III's children, Plantagenet blood divided into the houses of Lancaster and York, whose rivalry would culminate in the Wars of the Roses and ultimate unification under the Tudors. The Norfolk line descended from Thomas of Brotherton through the Mowbrays to the Howards, who remain Dukes of Norfolk today. This makes Thomas one of the few medieval nobles whose direct male line survives unbroken into the 21st century, bearing one of England's premier titles across 7 centuries. The Lancastrian connection flowed through Elizabeth of Rhuddlan to the Bohuns and eventually to Henry IV. When Henry Bolingbroke claimed the throne in 1399, he carried Edward I's blood through his great-grandmother Elizabeth. The Lancastrian kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, all descended from Edward Longshanks through this female line. The mathematics of medieval mortality tell a stark story. Of Edward's 16 children, at least 8 died before age 10. Yet those who survived compensated through remarkable fecundity and advantageous marriages. Joan of Acre, Elizabeth of Rhuddlan, Eleanor of Bar, and Margaret of Brabant together produced dozens of children who carried royal blood across Europe. Today, virtually every European royal family and most British noble houses trace some ancestry to Edward I through his children. The king who hammered Scotland and conquered Wales left his deepest mark not through conquest, but through the survival and success of his bloodline. In Westminster Abbey, where more than half his children lie buried, Edward I achieved the ultimate medieval victory, genetic immortality through descendants who would rule kingdoms, command armies, and shape the fate of nations for centuries to come.